Good afternoon and welcome to the second in our three-part series in Advance the Independent Living Movement, Out the Disability Community Vote. Today's topic will be Rev Up, Making the Disability Vote. My name is Ron Kermani and I'm your host today. It's a pleasure to be with you. A little bit of background about me. I'm a recovering newspaper reporter, 12 years with the Albany Times-Union as their chief investigative reporter. I went to the dark side then in my career and spent more than 30 years in public relations and advertising, being the public relations director of a very large public employee union, the Public Employees Federation. From there, I went to the New York State Trial Lawyers Association as their PR director and advertising director. From there to CSEA, the largest state public employee union in New York State, as their executive editor. And then I went to the very, very dark side and worked for the Bataki and Spitzer and Patterson administration as the Senior Vice President of Communications at the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation. So it's my pleasure to be with you today. And the Statewide Systems Advocacy Network, as you know it, SSAN, was created to support the independent living movement in the development of local partnerships and coalitions to engage in community education about issues impacting people with disabilities. The overall goal is to increase knowledge and visibility about the individual and societal importance of independent living, resulting in positive change in communities throughout New York State. SSAN workshops over the past 7 years have trained on community engagement strategies, models for effective community outreach and education, principles for holding and participating in community-based meetings, dealing with opposition, my favorite, engaging the press, the development of a timely Save Medicaid campaign, you may remember that, how to maintain the personal commitment to advocacy in the face of opposition and issue fatigue, and also workshops on campaigns for social change. This year's SSAN workshop takes community outreach and education back to where all grassroots advocacy must go to make real change. And as you know it, that's the ballot box. With local, state, and federal elections looming large this year, it's up to the disability community to let candidates know the power of the community's vote and to elect politicians with inclusive civil and human rights agendas. Now, just a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Closed captions are available for this webinar. You'll see a notification in the controls at the top of your screen. Select closed caption. After selecting closed caption, you will see the captioning at the bottom of your screen. Now, to make adjustments to the caption size, click on the arrow next to Stop Start Video and choose Video Settings. Click on Accessibility. Move the slider to adjust the caption size, and you may choose small, medium, or large, just as you do at Starbucks. If you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. I will monitor this Q&A box and relay the questions to our speaker. Now, during the Q&A portion of the session at the end of the program, you will be unmuted so we can have an open discussion. We can hear your comments. We will start the day talking about voter suppression and stakeholder education with Keri Gray. Keri is the Senior Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Strategic Communication for the American Association of People with Disabilities. In Keri's role, she works with AAPD to manage external partnerships, socially and politically motivate people with disabilities, and engage constituents through a variety of communication platforms. These duties will help support AAPD's mission to serve as a convener, connector, and catalyst for change, increasing the political and economic power of people with disabilities. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Keri. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation to speak today and to meet and chat with everyone that's on the line. I'm definitely very excited to dive into how are we advancing the disability vote? How are we ensuring that we're mobilizing our communities to get engaged? All of that is something that is critical for the success of our community and the advancement of our democracy. So 2020 is a very important year for our democracy. Every year we know is an important year, but particularly 2020 is critical. And we have some important decisions to make that will determine the direction of our country and our quality of life. So I have a declaration on behalf of every American and the pursuit, on behalf of every American that understands the true value of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that declaration is to our elected officials and candidates, that if disability justice and independent living is not part of your political framework, you are not worthy of our votes. For those candidates that go into negotiation rooms around our country's policies and systems, and disabled Americans are being sacrificed, the well-being of our community is being sacrificed to get a win somewhere else, then we will say none of us are free until all of us are free, and you are also not worthy of our votes. Now, I know our country has a long history of ableism and systematic oppression that is inclusive of racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, and more. You could kind of think that there are so many different obstacles, so many different reasons that our country and folks that are representing us across society will not take seriously the voice of disabled Americans. I know that we still lack disability representation, and it can be a rare and shaky acknowledgement of disability rights. But still, I also know that there was a brave group of disabled folks that crawled up the Capitol steps to demand change. That was civic engagement. I also know that there was a brave group of disabled advocates that took over a federal building in California to demand change. That is also civic engagement. So essentially for 2020, it's really important that we acknowledge that over 35 million voters are people with disabilities. Can you imagine what we could accomplish if we take a united stand to get registered and vote in the November 2020 elections? So as we do that, as we're thinking about all of the visions that we have for the future, as we're imagining what exactly we want to accomplish in terms of our people and our community, I think it's important for us to look at the lessons that 2020 in particular has taught us. This year alone has taught us the significance of having elected officials that prioritize emergency preparedness. We need elected officials that will immediately prioritize a pandemic and that will be an example of public safety. You know, I was talking to one of my colleagues not that long ago, and she's a mother who has a toddler, and she was telling me essentially that, you know, before the pandemic, she was looking and anxious and really hopeful for more opportunities that she could spend at home with her baby. And, you know, she's a working woman, so she's juggling a lot of different things. And she was talking about with the pandemic, it gave her that opportunity because things were shut down from daycare to school and things to that nature. And listen, we know that the struggle can be real to all of a sudden have a house full of people all day, every day quarantined together. At the same time, we also know that it's far more important for us to have representation of our officials and policy and priorities that are prioritizing our safety, rather than looking at how can we just get business back open, right? So what is the balance between ensuring that we have some people that understand that need for public safety and the need for our economy to keep growing? You know, unfortunately, we witnessed in the midst of this pandemic that over 63 million people that are currently on Medicaid had their services impacted and threatened in some type of way. We saw a debate around what exactly defines essential services. And so we're not just talking about the candy store up the street getting shut down. We're talking about public debates around doctor's offices, around medication, around the things that are essential to your everyday living of life, being debated on whether people should have access. We witness our community that relies on caregivers struggle even more so to get the support that they need. Right? So we know that in our community, as it is right now before the pandemic, ensuring that we had caregivers that were getting paid adequately, that were showing up to the job, that were doing what they need to do, could be a struggle. And now we saw that the shutting down of services made that even harder, and people were prioritizing or not prioritizing the safety benefits of coming into your home and ensuring that people have the access that they need. And so we also saw that we witnessed our community, which is overrepresented in nursing homes, mental health facilities, and jails and prisons, be gruesomely impacted by COVID-19. I don't know if you recognize this or not, but we are currently in a fight. 2020 is not just a year for us to live through. It is not just a year for us to try to get by. It is a year for us to ensure that we are reimagining and re-envisioning our society and demanding the same type of change that the people who came before us also demanded. So we know that there are many issues at play. And in order for us to work through these, we must be clear around the expectations that we have for elected officials, and we need to be in spaces where we are reimagining our society. So essentially how we do that is we are looking at our political framework. So we have to get our house in order. One of the things that we need to do is that we are bickering about the hierarchy of disability instead of unapologetically saying all disabled lives have rights, while we are also dismissing things such as racism. I think what's really important for us as we move into 2020 is looking at the philosophy of disability justice and intersectionality. So independent living is a powerful tool. Independent living allows us to engage our democracy through consumer control, knowing that we are the best experts of our needs. We can tell when people are looking at our community as a summation of medical conditions and problems to be solved. So it is our responsibility and our duty to take a hard look at the issues and people and see if they are worthy of our vote. From an economic perspective, it means supporting disability-owned businesses, centers for independent living, and particularly enforcing regulations that prevent the discrimination of disabled employees. Let me tell you why this is so critical. We are constantly in this cycle of why do we vote? Why is that something that I should prioritize? And I think given the nature of some of us that are working with various organizations, we can automatically understand the significance of it. But we have to explain that narrative and story to the broader community that is still struggling and wrestling with believing in electoral justice. So let me give you one example of this. I was talking to one of my students recently about her story of career development and transitioning from school to work. And I was asking her about what the process looks like. She's a young woman in our community who's very excited about transitioning in her career. And let me tell you, she is the type of person that you want on your team. She is the type of person that it doesn't matter what the task is, it doesn't matter what the role is. She is going to show up, she's going to contribute, she's going to voice her opinion, she's going to bring the type of positive energy that you need into that space. She is the type of person that you want to be working with within your organization. So I was asking about her career and just transitioning into work. And she looked at me with, a certain level of sadness because the struggle had been real. She was describing one instance in particular where she found out about a career fair that was being offered on her campus. And she said she prepared for it, she researched, she had all of her documents in order and ready to show up, because the career fair was advertised as a place where she could not only learn about different job opportunities, but she could potentially be interviewed and hired on the spot, right? And so she talks about she got up that morning and she hopped on a bus, and that bus took her about 30, 40 minutes. Then she hopped on a second bus that took her about another 30, 40 minutes to get to the actual career fair. So she got there, And the moment that she walked up to a booth and the recruiter saw that she was blind, the entire situation shifted. So she walked up to the recruiter and saying, "Hi, how's it going? I would love to learn more." And the recruiter automatically wants to extend his hand to shake her hand. And it turns awkward because he's like, "Oh crap, like, can she see my hand? I have these papers that I need her to sign and look over as a consent form, and she can't see the papers. I don't know if she can sign this document." And so for people with disabilities, this story and this narrative is not new. When someone confronts your disability and immediately is taken off guard. And that's not always the worst thing in the world, but the problem enters when that awkward conversation or situation turns into discrimination. It's one thing to say, "I don't know how to like say hello. How can we make this happen?" It's another thing to see the barriers or see something that you don't understand and then turn around and say, "This is not a good fit for us." And unfortunately, we see that situation in our community happen time and time again. If we're talking about employment as just one instance and situation, then we know that we have a lot of work to do to ensure discrimination does not occur. And when we talk about these issues, they are not just on an individual basis, but they are systemic. So meaning that this specific person that I'm mentioning, she had that circumstance with the Career Center. It didn't go well. It turned awkward, which turned into discrimination, which turned into one more time where she is not able to get a fair opportunity at employment. And she was telling me this story, and she said, "I've been on about 100 different job interviews, and over 90 of them, over 90% of them have been situations like that," right? And that's not just her story in one situation, knowing the ways in which that spreads throughout our entire community, when so many people still feel that we are not worthy of education, employment, healthcare, the list goes on, you name it. And so it becomes critical as we think about this concept of independent living, as we think about our responsibilities around civic engagement, that we are also thinking and reimagining the ways in which we are bearing fruit to economic prosperity and all of the different ways in which we should be successful. So we need people and we need systems that are fighting for us. And this philosophy of independent living and disability justice, I'm going to say, is critical to the advancement of civic engagement across our country. And I also have to say that it is incomplete unless we are operating through a framework of intersectionality. So when we are describing the situations of our future and we're talking about how can we move forward, how can we make progress across our country, we have to think about it through the lens of disability justice mixed with the justice of racial justice, of gender justice, of all the different ways in which our community intersects with groups across our country. And I mention that in particular because if we are thinking about voting, then who is talking about our issues in a way that does not erase our full stories? So let me give you an example of this. When we are describing civic engagement, I think of a young woman named Natasha McKenna. So Natasha McKenna was a young woman who was institutionalized in a mental health facility in Fairfax County, right outside of Washington, D.C. And her narrative went viral in the Black Lives Matter movement because she was a Black woman that was institutionalized, and they were attempting to transfer her from that facility in Fairfax County to another facility. But unfortunately, the way in which they went about it was extremely fatal. I won't, go into too much about it. I recommend folks do some research. But essentially, there is a video of Natasha's naked body that is handcuffed, and you see police officers that are surrounding her body as she is naked and chained. And they essentially go through, it's about a 40-minute long video of them harming her body through batons, through shock, through a variety of different things as they are attempting to transfer her. And in the midst of that process, she does end up passing away. And one of her last words that you hear is, "You promised that you wouldn't kill me." And so when I talk about this situation, of disability justice and independent living, it's critical that we acknowledge that it is very much tied to the oppression that we experience through issues such as racism. It is the combination of those two efforts that we have to bring across a new philosophy and ensure that we are actually talking about all of our people. Institutionalization intersects with state violence, and it is more vulnerable for the experiences of disabled people of color. And so as we look at the narrative of things that have happened to folks such as Natasha McKenna, and unfortunately the list goes on, to people who have been impacted by state violence, we have to recognize, how do we look and examine our elected officials and our community efforts in a way that is inclusive of the full and complete story. So next I will say, what do we do about all of this, right? We have envisions for the future. We know that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors that have taught us to create change and how to be engaged and involved. So going back to the notion that we need to get our house in order, it's important that we recognize that the over 35 million voters with disabilities that are eligible across our country is not just a number, but instead it is a collective effort of people that are saying, I'm going to sign up, I'm going to ensure that registration happens, and I'm going to utilize my voice. Now, as a nonpartisan organization with the American Association of People with Disabilities, and then I wouldn't be surprised if many folks in this conversation are also nonpartisan, we know that we don't tell people who exactly to vote for or which party ultimately has your back. Our message is clear that there are priorities within the disability community that are important, and that it is our responsibility, regardless of who you vote for, to vote. And so we have to get our house in order. That means that any of the bickering that is happening within our community that does not center independent living, disability justice, and a framework of intersectionality will not get us closer to liberation. We cannot talk about disability rights while also dismissing racism, sexism, homophobia, and more. That will not get us closer to liberation. So we have to evolve the way that we think. We have to evolve our attitudes, which will then impact our behaviors, which will then impact our actions. We have to have standards that we stick to. If you're not happy with your political options, the solution should never be, I will not vote, right? Like, we need to shut that down in our community. Instead, it is important that we channel the bravery of our ancestors, and we demand the inclusion that independent living and intersectionality calls for. I know that it is a wrestle, it is a struggle to be in a situation where I've heard conversation after conversation where it says, I don't know who to vote for. I don't know who these people are. And the ones that I do know, I don't like. And that's a real struggle that can happen year after year after year in our country. And it is so important that we look at civic engagement as a means to addressing this. So civic engagement can mean a lot of different things. Civic engagement can mean voting. Civic engagement can be volunteering. Civic engagement could be calling your representatives and folks across your elected officials and letting them know exactly what you stand for. It could be gathering folks for a protest. There are a lot of different options to get involved, and we've seen success through civic engagement. If you look at an example of even what's happening across the uprising right now with Black Lives Matter, and knowing that Black Lives Matter is an issue of disability justice, that we've seen that people have been able to use opportunities to create change. So one of the demands within this movement has been to arrest the officers of the people that have been killed through state violence. And we saw some success with that. We are not all the way there because we still have some work to do when it comes to addressing the injustices faced by Breonna Taylor. But we have seen some area of success when it comes to people's momentum and their civic engagement of pushing our country forward. We also see that as we are wrestling with what does it mean to have policing in our schools with our children. In some cases, we know that that can be helpful. In other cases, they have disproportionately impacted the punishment of students with disabilities and students of colors in our classroom. And so we have seen success and progress as people are considering whether to renew those contracts or whether to redesign the ways in which they function. My point is, regardless of what you stand for, it's critically important that you voice your opinions, that you think critically about our country, and that you engage in that process. And so the next thing that I'll cover is, how do we do that through the disability community? So one, I would love to give you some context on the American Association of People with Disabilities and our REV Up network. So AAPD is a national nonprofit disability organization. We focus on the political and economic empowerment of people with disabilities all across our country. And we do that through a variety of different programs and initiatives, whether that's through professional development, technology, transportation, civil rights, you name it. Specifically within AAPD, we have an initiative called REV Up. So that stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. REV Up was an initiative that started out of the state of Texas, and then AAPD was able to collaborate and take it on as a national initiative. Our mission is to foster civic engagement and protect the voting rights of Americans with disabilities. We are a group that believes in the power of disabled life, and we advocate for the advancement of our community. So within the REV Up network, we essentially have voting coalitions. So we work with over 30 states across the country with their voting coalition or as an ally to our network. And basically, the premise is that we do a variety of different things to get people involved. So that could definitely be making sure that people are registered to vote. That can be around voting, and that can definitely be around advocating around all of the issues that are important to our community and to our country. So this week, National Disability Voter Registration Week is one of the initiatives out of the REV Up campaign. And our premise and our thought behind this is that we want to collaborate with disability organizations all across the country, but we also want to think about acknowledging the fact that disability is something that is still a journey for a lot of people. So we know that even though there are about 1 in 5 people across the United States have a disability, it is still not as common to socially and openly identify with that disability, right? There's real and genuine factors that create that to be the case. And so essentially we know that stigma, abuse, trauma, and just story after story has created situations where people are hesitant to be open about their disability. And then in our community, we find it important to say, here's a space for you. Not only do we want to look at you as the summation of your medical conditions, but we acknowledge you as a person and as a human. And we acknowledge the fact that you deserve a right to education, to housing, to anything and everything possible. So one, we do a lot of work to just bring people into the fold, for them to know that there's a community and space that is advocating and fighting for your rights, your existence, even though so many people may have told us that you are not worth it. The second thing that we look at is like, how do we mobilize this community? How do we ensure that we are understanding our options? So I think this makes it important for us to address the issues that are related to voter accessibility and suppression. So when we're looking at the standard and typical way, I'm going to come back to, again, specifically in 2020, because we know that 2020 has been quite a year. But even outside of the specifics of what has happened this year, we know that voter accessibility and suppression has been an ongoing issue for a really long time. So voter accessibility really talks about everyone having access to show up, to vote, and to be able to get in without any complications, to be able to vote independently, and to be able to have the resources that you need to be able to cast your ballot. And so every year we have had complications behind ensuring voter accessibility because the requirements state that the infrastructure of the buildings need to be accessible. That if you need an alternative ballot due to your body functionality of writing, due to sight, blindness, or low vision and things of that nature, those options have to be made available to you. And still year after year, we are seeing issues behind folks being able to vote independently and folks being able to get access to the resources that they need. Particularly what we see in 2020 was that in the midst of the pandemic happening, we saw a lot of accessibility features being shut down and at a rapid pace. So I'll give you an example of this. Across the city of DC, typically we have, in addition to your standard poll worker, we also have what's called a specific accessibility poll worker. So these are the folks that are going around to the different poll sites and ensuring that the infrastructure is actually set up the way that it needs to be, that their ASL interpreters are available, that the voting machines are accessible. They are going through and ensuring the enforcement of your ability to cast the vote. Unfortunately, what happened this year is that we saw all the accessibility teams get shut down, and we are then relying on the couple of staff members that are directly hired by the government to execute the accessibility across the entire city. Now, that sets us up for failure in a lot of different ways, as you can imagine, because one, that is an issue definitely of capacity. Even if we are shutting down a number of the polling sites across our country, there are still some that remain open. And on top of that, in addition to the polling sites, there's assistance that election officials give to folks that are in institutions who still have the right to vote. And so they are now having to cover an entire city by themselves when they initially had a team that was working in collaboration with them. The second issue that we had is that in the midst of all of the pandemic escalating and the primary season that we've been in for a while, we saw that the rules and regulations of how exactly our elections were going to occur changed overnight, and nobody knew exactly how it was working. So that is not only a form of voter inaccessibility, but voter suppression. So we literally saw states that would announce the night before, there's only going to be 5 polling sites available, here's where they'll be located. And then in some cases, we didn't even see an announcement about that, but people had to do extensive research to figure out what exactly it means to vote. So voter suppression is really anything and everything that holds our community back from being able to access their given right to cast their ballot. So we saw, one of the things that we also unfortunately saw in the midst of rapid changes and all of the different, situations when it comes to voting in the primaries, we saw that ADA regulations were being pitted against human rights regulations in terms of racial justice. So we had a situation, particularly in the state of Georgia, where they were saying that they had to shut down polling sites because even more polling sites, because they were not ADA compliant. And the issue with that, outside of the fact that we are still very rapidly struggling to get any polling sites that are completely ADA compliant, is the fact that they were specifically shutting down these sites and neighborhoods and communities that were predominantly people of color and low income. And oftentimes we know the intersection that many of those people end up having disabilities. And so we saw the pitting of our communities against each other instead of a collaborative effort to ensure how do we get more people involved in our democracy and more people voting versus less people voting. And so suppression is something that exists across is traditionally talked about when it comes to communities of color, which is very true, but knowing that there's an intersection of what happens in the disability space, and knowing that we cannot just let it be something that where we are fighting against each other. The final thing that I will mention on the voter accessibility and suppression piece is essentially looking at, okay, so how do we, again, coming back to addressing this? So knowing that this week is National Disability Voter Registration Week, it is so critical that we continue to open up conversations that allow our communities to educate one another and get mobilized. So this year we focused on what does it look like to do our same efforts through digital and virtual organizing techniques. So that's different for a lot of people in our community, because typically we are a grassroots nature where we are meeting people in person, we are talking to people in person and preparing services, making sure that people feel secure and all of their everything related to any of the upcoming elections. So this year we were examining how do we do that same thing through a virtual nature. So one of the things that we really encourage folks to do is to leverage the technology that is accessible. And so we have a partnership with an organization called When We All Vote, which is another nonprofit in the broader civil rights community voting organization. And they allow for us to have a voting portal where folks can get registered to vote online in an accessible way. And so we have to be thinking about, like, what are the techniques that we can use that allow us to accomplish the same goal, even if it looks differently. In addition to that, tomorrow, AAPD is hosting a Rev Up the Vote Festival. So one of the things that we saw that became really popular in the midst of the pandemic was that more important people were still looking for ways to connect to community, to have a good time, even if it's through a virtual platform. And so we saw this year that a lot of virtual concerts became popular, a lot of battles between artists became really popular. All of these things are things that we can leverage not just for our entertainment, but as an opportunity for people to get involved. And so while we're in the midst of having an interesting and exciting activity, we want to get people registered. So tomorrow AAPD is hosting Rev Up the Vote Festival, and that is going to be a lineup of different musicians, talents, remarks from public figures and community members across the country. And that lineup is going to be engaging, it's going to be interesting, it's going to be fun, and it's also going to be an opportunity for us to talk about the issues that we need to be prioritizing across our country. And so that's one example of what an event can look like. We also want to be thinking about summits that could be hosted. We want to be thinking about social media and marketing, and ultimately the programs and initiatives that we can enact across our country to ensure that people are continuing to be involved in our democracy. So Rev Up is a platform. It is a network. It is a campaign. It is an opportunity for folks to get involved and to mobilize the disability votes. Folks can get involved through their local and state level, and also can get involved on a national level. So again, I just want to kind of go over a couple of the concepts one more time, and then wrap up with any thoughts on how to mobilize. So as we're looking at 2020 being a really critical year, where we're determining the direction of our country and the quality of our life, it's critical for us to examine what is at stake. What are the issues that we need to be prioritizing as a community of people? Do we have elected officials that are talking about emergency preparedness, that are talking about institutionalization, that are listening and involving the community and speaking in a way that we know really genuinely takes us into consideration? How can we ensure that it is our responsibility? How can we enforce the idea and knowing that it is our duty and our responsibility to engage? So that means cutting off the bickering. That means understanding the issues that are important. And that means getting people critically involved. And then finally, the thing that I will mention is fighting against voter suppression and ensuring voter accessibility. So there has been a lot of conversation around vote by mail this year. We have transitioned drastically to the majority of our country transitioning to a process where you can vote by mail. And I will say that largely that does work for a lot of people across our country. But the issue that we need to get moving on is knowing that vote by mail is not accessible to every American across our country. And if that is the case, then that cannot be our ultimate goal. We have seen the failures of our electoral process just based on what's happened in the midst of the pandemic. And come November, we have an opportunity to ensure all of those turn into are no longer failures, but are actually opportunities for folks to get involved and get engaged. And so in order to do that, we need your voice. We need your participation, we need your partnership, and we need folks to be thinking about the ways in which we can expand our partnerships and relationships. So that means being inclusive of disability justice, independent living in a way that also co-aligns with racial justice, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and so much more. We need to be thinking about how can we partner with the broader civil rights community? How can we build relationships that we can show other people what it means to advocate for disability justice and think through the lens of independent living? And then we also have to turn around and learn from the broader civil rights community about ensuring that we are doing more around building programs and initiatives that are inclusive of people of color in all of our different intersections. So I want to leave you with this idea of getting involved in a voting initiative if you are not already. That could be AAPD's Rev Up campaign. That could be what's going on in your local area. I want to leave you with the idea that it is our duty and our responsibility to fight for our freedom and our liberation. And through the philosophy of independent living, nobody can do that better than we can. And I want to ensure that we are not perpetuating any of the ideas that make us think that our lives are not worth living, and that elected officials, if they choose not to include us, we will hope again for the next 4 years. But instead, we will turn around and say, there's absolutely no way that you are worthy of our vote or worthy of our allies' vote if you are not including us in your initiatives. So again, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to encourage you to get involved. I want to encourage you to learn more about voter suppression and accessibility, and we are happy to work with you on any of those issues.
Keri, thank you so much. That was an impressive overview of the entire process on the national scale. We'll now open it up for questions. And at the bottom of your screen, folks, you'll see a Q&A button. Please click on that and type in your question, and I will take a look at that and be glad to forward your question to Keri, and she can respond to everyone. So please take a moment for questions and answers, and let's have it now. Keri, while everybody's thinking of some great questions for you, I have a couple. How does New York's political landscape, and as Byzantine as it is compared to other states, how does New York's political landscape make it more difficult or even make it easier to accomplish the goals that you've been talking about in the last 40 minutes?
Yeah, so New York is definitely in a interesting position because we know that the state of New York has had some of the highest numbers that have been impacted by the pandemic. Yeah. And we were talking earlier about how it's just a popular city, even though a lot of transportation has been minimized over the last so many months. There's still a lot of people that come in and out of the city. There's a lot of people that just live across the state. And so given the fact that people are trying to do their best to stay safe, which contrary to some people's opinion, we are still in somewhat of a quarantine, and knowing the fact that it's still our duty to make sure that we participate, we have to find that balance. So one of the areas that we want to make sure that happens is getting people more involved in vote by mail. So that gives folks the opportunity to vote from home. That gives folks the opportunity to feel good about the research that they can do around their options. And then it also presents the opportunity to say, if you if that is not an accessible option, then we need to do our diligence of getting together and ensuring that there are alternatives that are really a reflection of everyone participating.
Good. I think we're asking our participants around the state to unmute their microphones so you can ask a question directly. Is that correct, Robin?
Yes, everyone's been given the ability to speak if they would like to have a conversation.
We're open for suggestions and questions also, folks. One question for you, Keri, also, while people are thinking of this, what would we say would be the 3 biggest hurdles in New York State for accomplishing some of the very specific recommendations you had?
Okay, sorry. I was reading through the captions for that. Yeah, so, and just to clarify, you're talking about more understanding of the obstacles or more understanding of the solutions?
Well, let's do a little bit of both if you have a minute on that, please.
Yeah, so in terms of the obstacles, one, I would have to say that we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics around voter, suppression and accessibility. But
right.
Honestly, one of our biggest obstacles is still just getting people registered to vote. Right. And getting people wanting to engage in our democratic process. So this is an issue that exists across our entire country, where we are still needing more and more folks to get signed up and participated. And then it can be in a particular obstacle if you are a person with a disability, because you might have certain and specific needs when getting registered and understanding. You might need plain text and basic language. Like there can be so many different, things that can be one more step away from you wanting to participate. I think that also goes back to some of the comments that we were stating earlier, is that sometimes people don't want to participate in the elections because they don't know who's running. We might hear the names of the people that are running for president. They get a lot of, news cycle and attention, but we need folks to be voting for governor, for mayor, for school district appointments, and for judges. And there's all different types of positions that need to be voted for. And oftentimes those folks are not getting enough attention, and there's not enough individual investigation for folks to want to engage. And so the education component to this becomes really critical. And then it's hard too, because since we've been in the midst of this pandemic, the traditional ways in which we would reach people are no longer existent. So it might be standard and easy for someone to host a event at your office and invite the community out. Or there might be another event that's going on. It could be really common to have like some type of huge festival that's going on in your community. And as an organization or a group of advocates, we show up to that festival and we share a message around people registering to vote and what's happening in our own upcoming elections. But those things are just not really happening right now.
No, they're not. And that dovetails nicely, Keri, with a question from Phil in the field here. And his question is this: any ideas for reaching out to our folks who are disabled, who are not plugged into typical internet connections? The digital divide hits lots of our folks.
Yeah, that's one. I just have to say that's a really real situation, because we are trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to stay connected to people where we've transitioned into quote unquote more of a virtual society, but that's just not where a lot of people are in terms of their resources. So that's really real. In terms of some of the solutions to that, one of the things that we've had people do is, in a safe social distancing practicing way, is there are still certain locations that you can go to reach potential voters. So one, it's still possible to go to places that release services. So if there's like food pantries, if there's your local grocery store, like places that people will inevitably still end up having to go to.
Yes.
it's possible to try to have a representative or at least some type of messaging that's posted around those buildings to reach people.
Mm-hmm.
It also can be common to do things like phone banking and text banking. So for folks that may not have internet, they may still have a phone line.
Yes.
And there are certain platforms that you can use to start calling people and letting them know, hey, like elections are coming up. We need to make sure that you're registered and participating. And there's also opportunities that you can text folks along the way and just let them know, here's how you plug in, and you can reach out to us if you have more information. Those are a couple of ways to think about like reaching folks outside of like internet connection, but I think that that's a place where we can really still explore more creative thinking.
That's good. Other questions from the field, folks, please either unmute and talk to us or type a question in the Q&A box. We're here to help you. Thank you.
Comments. Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to say, Keri, I really resonated with what you said. I am a very difficult person to get the importance of voting, so to speak. I myself, as a person with a disability, I just feel completely unheard. But when I heard you talk, it really sat with me. So I really appreciate everything you had to say. It definitely offered me a different perspective. So I really appreciate that.
Good, we're glad to hear that. Thank you for offering that.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. And I do want to say, like, I can't underscore enough how challenging it is for people to think about voting. And I think that's something as like an advocate, as an organizer, as an employee, we need to accept that. I've been in a number of conversations where folks find that very frustrating and they respond to the hesitancy or sometimes straight up indifference that people have by saying, well, you don't have a right to complain about anything in our country. And although theoretically you may respond in that type of way, it's still not helping us get closer and closer to our goal. And so I think one of the things that we could do is to be honest about addressing the reasons that people are struggling with engaging in our process. And oftentimes we need more relatability from our candidates and elected officials who really understand what the everyday person is going through. And if you don't feel like you're getting that level of recognition or understanding, then it can cause a lot of people to pull back. And that's just one example. So I think it becomes so critical for us on our end to say, well, let's bring it up. Let's talk about, if we're not hearing enough about what's happening with caregivers right now, we're going to bring that up, you know, and we're going to hold our elected officials accountable and speaking about it. One of the things that AAPD did in collaboration with NICL, the National Council on Independent Living, is we released a presidential survey for the candidates. And we got, if y'all remember a few months ago, we had 1 million Democratic candidates that were running for president. And we actually got quite a few of them to fill out that, especially the top tier folks, to fill out that survey. And that was just one example and one step of accountability, because it forces their team to think about the issues that are top priority us and start to build out their plan now on how they're going to address them. And if they're not doing it now, and then they're trying to rush that priority in after they get into office, by that point, they already are going to have a number of conflicting priorities. And so, again, I just think, like, how can we as organizers really step up to create the conversations that need to occur and push our country forward?
Other questions, please, folks.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know if this is Sue from Binghamton. Just a couple of one is actually they're pieces of information, but maybe Keri and others would also have information to add. Last week, the League of Women Voters and the Campaign Legal Center filed a lawsuit against the New York State Board of Elections regarding mail-in or absentee ballots. And a primary plaintiff in the case is a woman who has a neurological condition that causes tremors. And she fears that her inconsistent handwriting would cause an absentee ballot to be rejected because of a signature mismatch. New York in 2018 discarded more than 34,000 absentee ballots, or about 14% of all absentee ballots that were cast, because they don't have a way to notify voters and give them an opportunity to respond if their ballot is in danger of not being counted. So I'm mentioning this because this case has just been introduced. We are hoping to see how it will be resolved, and hope that it gets resolved well before the November election. And the other thing is that the very good idea that was mentioned about the survey to the candidates on their disability agendas. I have asked people who are running for Congress and others, we should, I think, consider that for people who are running for state office as well as local office. Do you have a disability agenda, and would you publicize that before the election? So that's a really good idea. And I know many of the people in the SAN have had opportunities to have meet the candidates and debate participation, in those cases they ask people. But this year we have to do a whole lot more with social media and virtually than we have had to do in the past, not only to register people, but also to get people who are running for office to come forward and actually tell us what their thoughts are and what they are going to do if they get elected. Thank you.
Very good points, Sue. Thanks for letting us know about that. Will you be following that case at all? Is that of particular interest to you, Sue?
Oh, absolutely. I'll be following it. I'm real active in the League of Women Voters, and I'll send that information about that case to Megan, and she can distribute it. But yeah, I think we all need to be paying attention to that case. And Megan and others can talk about the other case about the access to requesting absentee ballots, because there were issues with that during the primary, yeah. And we suspect there are going to be more issues with that this fall.
Yeah, count on it. Absolutely. Other questions from the field, folks, please join us. Anybody else? Either through the Q&A or the chat box, or live with a microphone.
There's a question from Phil in the chat box.
Oh, there is. Thank you. Yes. Excuse me for that. Phil asks, again, on abandoned absentee ballots, our group should meet with the local Board of Election Commissioners to ask how they plan to reduce the number abandoned. There is also a problem with the electronic signature pad that in-person voters with disabilities that impair their ability to sign. And having been an election inspector, I'm familiar with this, Phil, but let's have Keri please weigh in on this.
No, I just absolutely agree. That's a partnership that I think is essential to civic engagement and voting work, is the local Board of Elections. And the local Board of Elections also can be secretaries of state that have a lot of weight when it comes to determine the regulations that we're taking in our voting process. And so I love your comments around a very specific acts, because there are just a number of things that we need to be getting our Board of Elections and secretaries of states to not just address widely and broadly, but know specifically how are we going to ensure that absentee ballots are being counted? How are we going to ensure that folks that you were mentioning, that's a real problem that I think relates to what we described earlier with vote by mail, is there can be an inconsistency in signatures. There can be some folks who aren't able to give a signature, and how do we ensure that they still have the right to participate? And so it is the responsibility of these groups to get that figured out. At the very, very least, we can voice what the concerns are. We need to be advocating aggressively and often to ensure that they actually get addressed, because it would not be fruitful to ignore that there are a lot of priorities, particularly right now. There are a lot of questions and concerns that are happening around our voting process, and we have to ensure that we're doing everything that we can on our community's behalf. So I just very much agree with you, and I think that that's an area that all of us can go behind.
Yeah, very good question, Phil. Thanks for offering that. Anybody else from the field, please?
Hi, Keri. This is Megan. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I really appreciated your talking about our need to make sure we're being intersectional in our work, thinking about intersectionality and plugging into movements like the Black Lives Movement right now. And I wondered if you had any suggestions for us in New York in terms of how some of us could do a better job maybe at supporting what Black Lives Matter is doing and also bringing our issues to them, so that we can both, be intersectional in our movements, and also how do we funnel that into getting people really engaged in the upcoming election.
Definitely love that. So one, I would say that it's still important that we do everything that we can to get this buy-in process around intersecting disability justice with racial justice. And I say that just as the honest truth. There have been a lot of examples and circumstances where we bring up racial justice and disability spaces and people are like, why are we talking about this? Why is this something that is even an issue on the table? What does it have to do with us? And unfortunately, we know it has everything to do with us, right? The majority of people with disabilities are people of color, but we wouldn't always know that with the way in which we work. So I think it's important that we do an assessment of where we are in terms of leadership, in terms of staff, in terms of programs and initiatives that are built around being inclusive of our various intersections. And those are usually conversations and a buy-in process that takes time. It's not something that you can say just once and people are completely behind you, but it's a journey and a process I think that usually takes a good period of time to get it to where we want it to be. I think in addition to that, right now is a great opportunity to really get plugged in because of the unfortunate deaths of folks like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many people. We are experiencing the uprising across our country right now. And for folks that are on social media, you may be following hashtag Black Lives Matter, but you may also be following hashtag Black Disabled Lives Matter. And so that was, that hashtag visit has been around for a while, but it's really a place to ignite a level of bravery. I think that in the midst of uprisings in general can be a little intimidating and scary, but particularly an uprising in the midst of a pandemic is something that is how am I supposed to get involved with this? And so one of the things that we wanted to do was encourage folks who, I have a prosthetic limb. And so I was if I happen to participate in a protest and I need to take off running, that's not going to be an option. I have to make a conscious decision stand your ground, right? And I went out to one of the protests with a friend of mine who's blind. And, you know, she also had to make a decision, like, I'm not gonna know where exactly to go, how to navigate the space. All of that to say, regardless of what your disability is, we wanted to show people that it's possible to get involved if protesting is one option of civic engagement that you're interested into. But it doesn't have to be just protesting, right? So there's a lot of advocacy right now around how do we address state violence? How do we ensure that if I'm calling for help on someone who's having an episode right now, they're also a person of color, that they don't end up in a fatal situation because there's a lack of disability justice at the intersection of racial justice. And so we just have to examine, what is our role? What is our place? Is that advocacy? Is that financial assistance? Is that protesting? Is that internal programs and initiatives? There are a lot of different options, but I think as we make that decision, we'll get closer. The second thing that I'll say to that is, you were mentioning getting the broader civil rights community and particularly racial justice groups more involved in disability justice. And I also agree with that premise, right? Because we know that as we get more out to groups that are not within the disability space, they may have a lack of understanding or just a lack of inclusion of what it means to amplify disability. That's also something that we saw through hashtag Black Disabled Lives Matter. Because we were uplifting the names of, you know, people who have been killed to state violence, but we weren't always acknowledging if they were a person with a disability. So, for instance, Tony McDade is the name of an individual who we were amplifying through the movement, but we weren't talking about Tony's disability. And those pieces of information become really, really important for us to work with groups around, to say not to erase that part of the narrative, because it's part of history, right? And so working with folks to collaborate, also working with folks because they have genuine questions and concerns. If people are organizing any type of activity that is rooted around racial justice and they aren't familiar with disability justice, then they'll start to question, like, how are we supposed to bring people with wheelchairs? How are we supposed to communicate with folks that are deaf and hard of hearing? And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with my student, and just saying awkward situations turn into discrimination. And we want to prevent that across all community places. And so I think opening those lines of communications and starting with at least a couple of projects that we can collaborate on can make a really, really huge difference.
Any other questions out there? We're going to take we're looking at a 5-minute break here, and we'll be coming back shortly. So if that's good, any other questions out there before we go to break? Very good. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll see you at about 8 minutes after, and I'm sorry, 2:15. Very good. Thank you. Okay, let's get back on track here. Keri, can you hear me and unmute your microphone?
Yep, I can hear
Very
you.
good. Okay, let's get back. Welcome back, everybody. We will continue our discussion with Keri Gray by talking about leveraging candidate questionnaires and forums to advance your cause and making the most of RevUp's tools and resources. Keri.
All right, so for this next part, I wanted to share more information about the RevUp network and some resources that we have to get people plugged in around civic engagement. Oh, it looks like I cannot share my screen. I'll kind of do a verbal representation of that. And so if folks happen to be by a computer, I would recommend go to aapd.com /advocacy/voting, and that will be the place that I'll start. I'll share that in the chat right now for folks who happen to be able to.
I've enabled your sharing. You can do it now.
Oh, let me see. Oh, there we go. And let me share my screen. Okay, great. So this is the RevUp website. So this is kind of our hub for folks that are interested in getting involved and working more with, you can work with partners. We connect folks that are in your state. And then we also do as much as we can to connect folks with organizers across the entire country. And we have our national initiatives as well. So the first thing I would mention when being on the RevUp website is if you scroll towards the bottom of that page, there's a link that says join the RevUp campaign email list. This is definitely one of the easiest ways to get plugged in. So then you'll receive all of our announcements around policy initiatives that we are working on, and also around different events and campaigns and such that we're running. So if you're already on our email list, you'll definitely be seeing information around National Disability Voter Registration Week and around our RevUp Festival that we're hosting tomorrow. When navigating RevUp and kind of like how we go about our various initiatives. The first place that I'll point out is that for folks that are looking to get registered to vote, this is kind of our first and simple way to go about this. So people can click on register to vote and it will automatically take you to the RevUp portal. So this portal and this link is something that's available for all disability advocates to use. You don't have to be a person with a disability to get registered on this platform, but it is something that, you know, we wanted to create it specifically for the disability community. So on this platform, it shows on the top left that we have the partnership through When We All Vote, the organization I was mentioning earlier. It has the AAPD logo and the RevUp logo. And then underneath that, it has the information that you need to actually get registered to vote. So folks are able to type in their information. You can select the language if you're not an English speaking person, and it'll get you all signed up and ready to go. So we really encourage folks to utilize this in your work or on your individual capacity and get registered. The next thing I'll point out is that we do have a hub for things related to upcoming elections. And so when you go to this web page, we essentially try to break down your options. It can be an immediate space where you can look up voter registration deadlines, which is really important, particularly for folks that are doing absentee ballot or needing to make sure that they're registered in time. There's a hub where you can go to learn more information about local and state elections and initiatives. So if you want to look at an example of what your ballot is, if you need to look and see who's running for different positions, and then there are a lot of like sublinks that tell you more and more information along the way. So this can be a really good place to do that. And then particularly for the 2020 elections, I mean, originally it was a lot more information on here. As we mentioned, this There were a lot of candidates that were running so many months ago. So originally we had a long list of people that were running. We had information around their disability policies and platforms, and anything that we could find that connected them to the disability community, we would attempt to post. So some of that is archived in case there's ever a reason where you want to go back and be like, what did Senator Warren say about disability policy? What did Castro or any of the different candidates say? As y'all know, the primary focus right now is on Vice President Biden and President Trump. And so on this website, it'll take you to their campaign website. It will show their responses to the AAPD Nickel Presidential Questionnaire that I mentioned. And then it'll also share any of the information that we were able to gather about their relationship with disability and their policy priorities on that subject. And then another area that you would likely use a lot when it comes to the Disability Vote and Rev Up Network is the page that is for community organizers. And so when you click on this page, there are definitely a number of options. So the premise behind this is like, how do we ensure that everyone is equipped and with the resources and tools that they need to really mobilize the disability vote? And so the first thing that we talk about is for those folks that are interested in a Rev Up coalition and you want more information around, you know, what is a Rev Up coalition? How do I get plugged in? There's one page that will give you at least some starter information to work with. And then essentially once you're pulled in, when you officially sign up for the network, we do orientation. We make sure that you're equipped with even more details to get plugged into the network. I will say that following National Disability Voter Registration Week, the end of this week, we are planning to do some pretty assertive outreach across the country. And we are looking to get a clear understanding of civic engagement work across for the disability community across our country. So I might have mentioned that Rev Up started in 2016. And since then, we've grown so much. And now is a time and an opportunity for us to get a deeper assessment of what type of programs and initiatives are your voting coalitions or partnerships doing today. And it's an opportunity for folks that are interested in joining but haven't done so yet. So if you're not, again, already on our email list, then I encourage you to get signed up, because we'll be sending out a lot of different opportunities about how to plug in, what does it mean to plug in, how do we get you connected to, you know, various people in your area. This tab is actually, I think, a good resource for folks. So we recently hosted Power the Disability Vote, which was a summit on elections and disability and election summit. So this happened a couple of weeks ago, and there were a variety of speakers and panels that were part of the summit. The reason I bring this up is that people are able to listen to the playback of it. So the presentations were about voter suppression and accessibility. We're about collaborating with the broader civil rights community. We're about collaborating with election officials. There were conversations and presentations on all of those segments, and so you're able to look at the agenda for each day and watch the playback to get all of that information. I will say that it was a pretty engaging experience. We had you'll see on this page that over 800 folks participated live, and we continue to have people that are watching the playbacks, and the chat box was very interactive, so I think it's a good resource. The other thing that I'll mention is that we were able to have participation from both Vice President Biden and President Trump's campaign. So Vice President Biden, he spoke himself. And so on our website, you're able to view his remarks and see how he's described disability policies and priorities. And then for President Trump, he had his senior advisor for the Trump campaign, Laura Trump, give remarks. And then also Maria Town, AAPD's president and CEO, she had a talk back with surrogates from both of the campaign's election as well. So these are resources that folks can use in your work to learn more and to share, particularly with the presidential candidates, kind of where they stand with things. In addition to that, we have an entire page that is dedicated to resources for voting organizers. So when you look on this page, one of the things that you'll notice is there's this continued conversation about what are the issues that are important to the disability community. So is that employment? Is that education? Is that transportation? Granted, all of these issues are very important. And then we're thinking about how do we interact those issues with candidates. So that is why AAPD has an issues guide as at least a starting place that can be customized based on your state, and it allows people to at least have an understanding if they ask you, so what does it mean to even get involved in disability issues? It can be a resource. We also have several other resources on our website, and so you can see accessibility is an issue. One of the things that happened also in 2019 and in 2020 was that originally all of the presidential candidates, none of their websites were accessible to people who use like screen readers. And so that becomes a situation where it is prohibiting people's access to know who's running for office and if they should vote for them or not. And so thankfully that became a way in which people started to advocate across our country, and we saw change. We saw people figuring out how to be accessible. So the accessibility toolkit covers some of the foundational areas that, whether that's Board of Elections, whether that's a candidate, that they should be covering to remove any barriers when it comes to voting. So there's quite a bit of information on here. If you scroll through, there's a lot of connections to various like organizations that do disability work in a variety of ways. So you'll see resources on here from government, state, and national officials. You'll see information from places like the Bazelon Center, Self Advocates Becoming Empowered, Rock the Vote. There are a variety of organizations that cover the bases. And as you can see, I'm still scrolling on this page. So there's quite a bit of information here as people are looking for ways to get plugged in. I'll also definitely point out National Disability Voter Registration Week, which is where we are at right now. So in case you are not already getting plugged in and involved, we have a couple of really easy tools so you can even participate now. So the main area that I would direct people to is our 2020 social media toolkit. So when you're on our page, we give you some automatic like posts that your organization can use on. You can post them on your website, you can post them across social media, you can use them in a variety of different ways to spread the message about the disability vote and get people registered and engaged. So we encourage you to sign up if you can get involved in any type of way. At the completion of National Disability Voter Registration Week, we are planning to connect all of the state advocates so that you know who all is doing what and how you could potentially plug in with other people across your state. So there's a number of different like great resources on here and ways to get plugged in. Okay, and then I want to go back to the original page. I want to point out 2020 census. So in the midst of everything that's going on in terms of voting, we also know that it is a census year. the census happening every 10 years across our country, we know that it is so critically important that we are pointing out that people should get counted. And I mentioned that because this year with the pandemic, the census was extended. So originally everyone should, around this time, we would be wrapping up when the census gets finalized. But now through everything that's with the pandemic, the census has been extended to October, if I'm not mistaken. And so that gives us essentially just more time to make sure that we are actively reaching people. So one of the things that we're going to be posting on our website is a project that we did to really promote the census, and note that partners are welcome to use this. So I'm actually going to share a different version of my screen. So Census Matters is a campaign that we helped develop for folks to use in promoting the census. The premise behind this is that the census essentially distributes a lot of resources and funding to your community. And it helps with some of the essential pieces of our day-to-day lives. So we wanted to create a post that would connect to a simple image and really describe why it's so important to get counted in the census. So just as an example of this, on this slide right here, it shows an image of a couple of like school books and folders and like a pencil, a ruler, an apple, and it's essentially a post about education. And the post beside it says, completing the census can help you get the education you deserve. So over 7 million children in the United States rely on special education and early intervention services to get the support they need to succeed in school. Complete the census, secure funding, and secure a happy, healthier future by completing the census today. So I share that as like one example. This is a resource that we'll be posting on our website very soon, and we really want to encourage people to participate in the final push of getting people counted and making sure that resources are available across our community. So the campaign covers education. We talk about Medicaid is an essential piece. We get Medicaid funding for your state based on people filling out the census. So we talk about, you know, how Medicaid impacts children with disabilities, and we have the image like of an asthma pump, and on health coverage and prescriptions are a big component of Medicaid. And so there's an image of one of those scope things. I'm forgetting the name right now. So Medicaid and housing and employment and SNAP are the areas that we cover in this process. So again, as we post that, we really encourage people to use this and to hype up the fact that we need people to continue getting counted in the census leading up to the deadline. And so I'll go back to our website. And so I'll point out two more things and then open it up for any final questions and comments that people have. So another initiative that we are working on this year is, for the first time, we launched a program called the Fannie Lou Hamer Leadership Program. So this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier around intersecting disability justice with racial justice and other components as well. So the Fannie Lou Hamer program is an initiative that we designed specifically for young, so folks ages 18 to 30, Black disabled advocates. And we named the program after Fannie Lou Hamer. So folks who may not be familiar with her, this is a picture of her on the website. She's a Black woman. She has kind of medium length hair. It's a little wavy. She's holding a microphone, and she's currently surrounded by 4 other individuals in the photo. It looks like she's speaking at a rally. And essentially, Fannie Lou Hamer is very much known for her work around the right to vote, and particularly the right to vote for Black folks in the South, particularly in Mississippi. She did a lot to fight for people's representation at a time where there was just blatant rules and regulations that would prevent people of color from voting, particularly Black folks. What often does not get talked about enough is that Fannie Lou Hamer did this advocacy while also having disabilities. So as a child, she had polio. And then something that also can be common is people form disabilities out of situations of trauma. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, she was thrown into jail at one point for trying to execute her right to vote. And when she was thrown into jail, she was beaten while she was in there, to the point that she had permanent disabilities as she came out. She walked with a limp, and then she just had damage across her body. But even after that situation, she did not stop fighting for her people's right to vote. So we named this program in honor of her legacy. And essentially the program has 3 components. So the first component is that our organizers went through a series of political educations. So they talked about what's at stake in our elections for 2020. They talked about how to build a campaign that actually reaches people. And they talked about the issues that related to voter suppression and accessibility. What was really great about the political educations, in the midst of the organizers learning a lot and getting prepared to launch a campaign, is that it is a really, really good way to build relationships with the broader civil rights community. So through the political educations, we essentially were able to get speakers and partnerships with organizations such as Color of Change, Center for American Progress, Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight. We worked with the Board of Elections, and there's a few other organizations on here as well: Alliance for Justice, the Leadership Conference, the National Urban League. If folks are familiar with Amani Barbarin from Disability Rights Pennsylvania, these were some really, really great partnerships. And we're essentially going to turn around, and the organizers are in the process of phase 2, which is campaign preparation, where they're essentially building the content and material for their campaign. So come September, they will be launching that campaign. And from September through the November elections, you will see messaging, you will see videos, you will see emails, you will see meetings and activities that are talking about all of the issues that are related to the intersections of the Black vote and the disability vote. So that's one thought, that's one idea of how we can start doing more activities and engagements that center the experience of people that are most heavily marginalized. The final thing that I will mention is our disability issues and advocacy page. So I am personally not the biggest policy person. I more so do the mobilization piece, the civic engagement piece, but it has all of that has a strong relationship to policy. So when you go to our advocacy page, you can see the areas that we have done a lot of focus on for the last so many years. So that's integration, community integration, education, technology, employment, transportation, etc., that have been real areas of focus. Also, if you go to our policy position and sign-on letters page and scroll towards the middle, you'll start to see what are the active policies that we are advocating for or against in 2020. And so one of the things I think that is important to note is that issues are nonpartisan. So we are not talking about vote for this person or don't vote for this person, but we are talking about the issues that are really critical for us to address when it comes to the momentum of our country. And so, for instance, you'll definitely see what is going on with COVID-19, the relief packages that have been passed or in the process of potentially getting passed. You'll see information that talks about our stance on what's happening with nursing homes and with election assistance, and there's been information around racial justice and policing. So there's quite of a extensive list, and this isn't even all of it, that goes over what are the priorities and the policies that we should be looking at to ensure that folks are treated fairly across our country. So in a nutshell, that kind of shows a little bit of how to navigate our website. And again, we just really encourage folks to get involved, join our listserv. We'll make sure that you're connected to people across our state. If you're interested in learning how to do more of these initiatives, so plugging into National Disability Voter Registration Week, designing a program such as the Fannie Lou Hamer Leadership Program, plugging into an initiative such as the Summit, that is definitely an area that we are most willing to talk about. So again, I want to thank you. Let me know if you have any questions, any thoughts, and happy to share more.
Keri, thank you. That is one impressive website and one impressive presentation you delivered today. Once again, we'll open it up for questions from the field. Folks, either unmute your microphone and chime in here, or use the Q&A box or the chat box, please, on the bottom of your screen. Keri, how long did it take you to produce all of this material? Is this a one-year project to get all of this website up and running, or have you been working on this for a bit of time?
You know, it's definitely a rolling basis type of thing. So thankfully, I think through partnerships, it can make it kind of easy to put some of those things on. So for instance, AAPD, we're not trying to claim that we're an expert in deaf culture, but we do have a relationship with an organization called Sign Vote. Mm-hmm. And they're an organization that specifically releases resources around the intersections of the deaf community and electoral justice. And so we're able to work with them, and it's like they have a toolkit, they have a new resource, we put that on our website, we connect them to them. And the same thing goes down the line with so many different organizations that are focusing on, there are some groups that are really trying to look at, you know, the institutionalization part of this conversation, and what does it mean to, you know, ensure that people who have guardians are able to vote and things of that nature. So I would say this would not have been possible without some real partnerships.
Yes, and coming from the political atmosphere here in the state capitol in Albany, the importance of coalitions cannot be overestimated or talked about, because politicians, as you know, respond to money and persuasion and size of the groups. And so just talk for a minute while we're getting some questions together here about what coalition building means and why it's important for both members of the community as well as the legislators.
Yeah, no, it's so critical. So I think there's like so many things that we want to accomplish, and then we are constantly having to design and shape that vision based on resources, based on capacity, based on knowledge. And so that's where our partnerships become really, really critical. We have a goal this year, well, actually going into part of 2020, that we want to get 2,000 people with disabilities registered to vote. And AAPD has the capacity to make so much of that happen, but really what's going to make it possible is when we're working with people all across the country that are promoting this message that voting is important. So that's why we wanted to partner with, you know, a variety of different disability organizations, but we also wanted to partner with places like Rock the Boat, that has like a really extensive network of people that know how to reach folks. They are super great about amplifying the work of others, and just highlighting, here's something really great that's going on. We were able to get a couple of voter registration portals through their network. So AAPD doesn't technically like design the portal, but to have a partner that ensures that we have access to one becomes really critical. Even things like being able to get Vice President Biden and President Trump's campaign to participate, that was only possible through partnerships and people who said, we will help you reach out to them. We will help make sure that this is a priority on their agenda. You know, so the relationship building like really only continues as we just, you know, build with more and more people.
Yeah, the power of numbers, and it works.
Yes.
Yeah, in the local elections, in the state house and beyond. Exactly right. Any questions, folks, from the field before we wrap this up? Very good. Well, thank you, Keri, for everything you've done, and thanks for all of you for attending today. And we appreciate your engagement in all you do for independent living in our communities across New York State. Now, as a reminder, please complete the evaluation form that will be emailed to you, and we value your input and encourage your ideas for future programs. Now, please mark your calendar to join us next month for part 3 in this series. And as GOTV, Get Out the Vote, the time is now. And that program will be held on Wednesday, August 19th from 1 to 3 p.m. We'll feature Andy Lee of the League of Women Voters and New York State Assemblyman Angelo Santabarbera with a roundtable of independent living representatives from around the states. So again, we appreciate you all being with us today. And until next time, be safe and be well.